Hate and Domestic Terrorism. The event is free to the public. It begins at 6:30. The keynote speaker is Daryl Johnson, who spent 25 years in U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies, including 6 years as the senior domestic terrorist analyst for the Department of Homeland Security. He's written books on domestic terrorism, most recently Hateland, a long, hard look at America's extremist heart. He authored a 2009 intelligence briefing for DHS, warning of the growth in domestic extremist groups. It was buried and dismissed for political reasons at the time, but in light of recent events, those warnings turned out to be very prescient, and those warnings will continue tonight and beyond.
So my message to your audience tonight is basically we're in a heightened period of risk, and that is not going to be going away anytime soon.
This risk goes back to just last fall. In fact, the FBI director was speaking to the House Homeland Security Committee and saying the top threat we face right now from domestic violent extremists stems from those we identify as racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. We've seen that play out in the latter half of 2020. Why do you think this has grown to the point now where it's on a radar, even though it was on your radar years ago?
Yeah, so I guess the fact that the threat came all the way to the doorstep of our legislators who've neglected this problem for almost a decade now has served as a wake-up call. The fact that these groups and individuals thrived under a Republican administration goes against all the trending data that I've observed the past 4 decades. So the fact that the Democrats are now back in power, this is the time where these groups tend to be very active and agitated and carry out violent attacks.
So let's touch on that. Why does your data show that? You mentioned over the last 4 decades, it has a lot to do with whatever party is in power in the White House. Why is that, and why the last 4 years have bucked that trend?
Yeah, so typically during Democratic administrations, these types of far-right groups they're ultra-nationalistic, they're xenophobic, some of the groups are racist. So any policies that have to do with gun control, laxing immigration, expanding minority rights, these are hot-button issues for these far-right extremists and get them agitated, fearful, and paranoid. And that fear and paranoia and agitation fuels the mobilization towards violence. So what made this Republican administration different is the fact that they pandered these extremists and also mainstreamed some of their rhetoric and platforms. I'm talking about things like building a border wall along the Mexican border. I'm talking about the Muslim ban, banning travel, people from the Far East and Middle East. I'm talking about, the immigration policies that happened under the Republican administration and likening immigrants coming from Central America as invaders and things of this nature. This was the type of thing I saw on KKK and neo-Nazi websites 15, 20 years ago, and now they're being put forth as policy by the previous administration. So that's why these groups flourished. And then you had the wild card, the pandemic, that came upon us last year, and this really agitates the anti-government crowd because they're fearful of all the, government regulations surrounding, how many people can assemble together, whether or not you're wearing a mask, whether or not businesses have to close early, things like this, and they look at it as an infringement upon their constitutional rights and freedoms.
Is there a geographical rhyme or reason